That in the House, if they're not speaking, please make sure you have your mask on. It's just for your own safety and the safety of others. It's being considerate. The honourable member for Haldimand, Norfolk.
That was a typical non-answer. We're all employed in this House. We need to have some compassion for those 200,000 people that are unemployed. We're not just talking about 200,000 jobs. We're talking about 200,000 families that are now wondering how to put food on the table, how to pay their bills, all while facing record inflation. So I ask my question again. When will this Prime Minister and this government allow Canadians to get back to work and to get on with their lives?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I actually agree with the member opposite that jobs are the single most important thing when it comes to the well-being of most Canadians and most Canadian families. And that's why when Canada lost 3 million jobs at the depth of the pandemic lockdowns, our government knew we had to act. And we did, with unprecedented support for workers and businesses. And the good news, Mr. Speaker, is that action worked. Canada has had one of the strongest jobs recoveries in the G7. 101% of jobs recovered compared to just 87% in the US, for example.
L'honorable député de Jonquière.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, all the premiers asked the federal government to pay its fair share of healthcare funding. They unanimously reiterated that the federal government must increase its health transfers to cover 35% of costs. They're reaching out to this Prime Minister yet again in the hope of reaching an agreement in the coming weeks. A simple question. Will Ottawa finally pay its fair share and cover 35% of healthcare costs? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, my colleague knows full well that from the beginning of the pandemic, our government was there to support Canadians and the public healthcare system throughout Canada. We have invested over $64 billion, and that's just over the last 2 years, in order to support the healthcare system. The Prime Minister was clear that we will always be there to work with our partners in the provinces and territories to support the public healthcare system that Canadians want. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, it's a shame, but the investments that the Minister's talking about are not sustainable. They are linked to pandemic expenditures. I have a challenge for the Minister. If he thinks that the current rate is sufficient, he should look at what our leader is proposing, which is to hold a healthcare summit. If they say that 22% is enough, I promise that I'll never mention this again. When will they commit to holding a healthcare summit? The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs. Thank you. My colleague knows full well that for nearly 2 years now, the Prime Minister has had over 35 meetings with premiers of provinces and territories, and several times we have discussed together what we can do to support the public healthcare system that Canadians want. We are always discussing with our counterparts in provinces and territories to find the best way to support a high-caliber healthcare system. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, there's a price to be paid for underfunding healthcare. This network is stretched to the limit, and they're just hoping that nothing unusual will make it break. Today, Quebecers have the impression that they're the ones paying the price with offloading and lockdown measures. The healthcare system now has to be rebuilt, and the federal government has to prove that it's learned from its past mistakes. When will the government finally understand that they have to invest urgently in the healthcare system? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I explained just a few moments ago, we've invested urgently into the healthcare system throughout Canada. We were there from the beginning of the pandemic to support Canadians, Canadian businesses, and the essential healthcare system for all Canadians. When the pandemic is behind us, we will be pleased to sit down with the premiers of provinces and territories, as we have done for months, to discuss essential funding for years to come.
Freeland, Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, a recent study stated that lockdowns contributed to saving 0.2% of deaths worldwide. Do you know what contributed to lockdowns in Canada, Mr. Speaker? The abysmal lack of healthcare capacity in that system. The $700 billion spent on COVID created no new beds and none of the promised 7,500 doctors and nurses from this Prime Minister have materialized. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, when will the government properly fund healthcare?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition keeps referring to lockdowns, and I want to be really precise and understand exactly what they're talking about. What federal mandates do they oppose? Do they oppose that people have to be double vaccinated to get into a plane or to get into an airplane or to drive a truck? If they oppose that, as they have some of their members of their caucus who still are not vaccinated, can they say that? And can we have an honest discussion about the fact that perhaps they don't believe in some of the public health measures that have Canada have one of the lowest death rates in the world and one of the best pandemic responses in the world, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Member for Cumberland, Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, in spite of the spin doctors, I am a doctor, and I want you to know that Canada has 1/3 of the ICU capacity of Germany and roughly half of that of the United States. The moral distress of working in an unsupported system and an overwhelming tsunami of backlog of cases looms. As Premier Horgan said on Friday, a quality service like this is not sustainable in its current model. When will this Liberal government end this moral distress and admit the pandemic crisis is multiplied by healthcare underfunding?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, our ICUs are filled. Canada is continuing to be in a circumstances we're seeing globally where we have enormous stress. But I would say to the opposite member, who is a doctor, that does he not want to see those numbers come down? Would he not agree that the best way to make sure those numbers come down is that people are vaccinated, that the vast preponderance of people filling our hospitals are unvaccinated, that him attacking mandates that, by the way, on our side are about ensuring people are vaccinated are injurious to this and are filling our hospitals and are exactly the problem we're facing right now.